It's really a pleasure to be invited here today. It's, I guess, telling how many people I recognise. Some of them, the last time I saw them, they were in Nunawading uniforms many, many years ago. But it is a pleasure to see you here today and to be invited along. Who likes the rain? No one. No one likes the rain. I love the rain. Oh man, I love it when it rains. There's a word for it, like what is it? Pluviophile. I'm a pluviophile. That sounds dirty, but it actually means if you love rain, pluviophile. That's what it means. I love it when it rains. I guess gardeners like it when it rains as well. And I want to ask, who's the gardeners here? Put your hand up if you're the gardener here. Some of you, yeah, some of you, I've heard you talking about your gardening already this morning. Anyone? There's a few. Is it good when it rains? The gardeners, do you like it when it rains? Is it because you don't have to water the garden yourself? Yeah, that's why. I thought so. I suspected. I don't have the gift of gardening at all. Quite the opposite. I wish I had that gift. I think it would be amazing. The best I can do right now is barely keep a plant alive. But from an early age, I realised I didn't have that gift. I inherited my mother's gift, the black thumb, right? Plants in low charge swiftly died as they trying to escape life with me more quickly. I just accepted, that when people gave me a plant, it's because they had something against that plant. They wanted it to die. And so they gave it to me, and I would make sure that happened. A plant killer. The best thing I could do for plants was avoid them. And it wasn't hard to do where I grew up. Here in Broken Hill in far west New South Wales. Have you ever wondered why the dirt around the middle of Australia is red? It's because of the amount of iron in the rocks there. The iron literally rusts. It oxidizes under the intense weather conditions, under the heat. So the centre of Australia is literally rusting. That's that red colour. The dirt there is a rich red, and I love it. I grew up with it. It's kind of in my blood, I love that red soil. You can't grow anything in it though. There's no nutrients in it. It's really difficult to grow things in it. And so what we had was this sort of like scrub dotted around the landscape. And there'd be some trees where there was regular water flow. You wouldn't call them rivers. Rivers, you imagine nice, gently flowing water, but there wasn't anything like that where I lived. We'd probably call them creeks. They would flow when it rained, and it did rain. So you'd have no rain for the entire year. Then in about 2 days, it would dump all the rain and we'd have floods. And our roads would be washed out, and there would be some wildflowers that pop up. But for the most part, it was just scrub. Past Broken Hill and in kind of this vast area out there is actually sheep stations. They can't grow anything out there like wheat, or they can't do crops, so they have sheep. And these, you've probably heard of these enormous stations, right? How big these stations are. That's because there's so few plants there. They need the big area to feed their sheep. It's an incredibly hard place to grow anything in that desert area. And, it's a neat allegory for our spiritual life, isn't it? As Tracy prayed about us being, I guess, people who grow. We want to grow like plants. And we find that it's easier to do that when we're not living in a desert. But incredibly, the consensus is the verses I'm going to look at today from Philippians were written by Paul while he was in prison. There's a couple of references in the first chapter of Philippians that point to him being chained up. Verse 7, he says, whether I'm in chains or defending and confirming the gospel, all of you sharing God's grace with me. And the book of Philippians is really made all the more incredible because it was written when he was locked up in prison. And when you read Philippians, he encourages believers to live this humble, quiet life centered around Christ. And he writes this while in the midst of incredible suffering. And you'd expect anyone else who is in prison to write a very different kind of letter. I know I would. I'd be like, get me out of here, please. Come and break the walls, free me. I would be terrified. Not Paul. He's thinking of others while he's in chains. He's caring for them and not for himself. And so I want to look at that today. Philippians 4, verses 11 to 13, what Paul says about how he does that. So I've got the first verse, just making sure it's working. I'm not saying this because I am in need, for I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances. And the context here is that the church has sent him some gifts. They know he's in prison. They've sent him some things to make it a little easier of him. And he's thankful for it. And in chapter 4, verses 10 and 11, he says he's thankful they're showing their care for him, but not because he needed anything. He says, I'm not saying thanks because I am in need. He is in need. For I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances. He's more thankful for their generosity because it's a sign of who they are, rather than because he got something that he needed. And he says, I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances. It's a different word Paul uses here, content. Content. It's kind of got implications of peace and happiness. And the English word content is a really good translation for the Greek word that Paul uses. The two Greek words mean yourself and sufficient. And he's joined those two words together and they've translated it as meaning content. You are sufficient within yourself. Paul's saying, I am sufficient within myself. Content, right? That's what it means to be content without need of anything external. Now, it doesn't mean isolated, doesn't mean alone, because Paul's connected, right? He's not solitary. He's connected by these letters with people. He's not isolated, but he's content within himself. He doesn't need anything from them or anyone else to make him content. How does he do that in prison? Well, did you catch that it was something Paul said he had to learn? I have learned, right? I have learned to be content. It's not something that came naturally to Paul. He had to learn how to be content. He had to change from being discontent to being content. And if you read some of his earlier letters, you can definitely hear that Paul had reason to complain and be discontent. He'd been through it all, shipwrecked, beaten, jailed multiple times. If anyone has a right to be discontent, it's Paul. But he says, I've learned how to be content when I'm in need, whatever the circumstances. And so he's saying him being content is not based on whether he's in need or not. Whether I'm in need or not, he says, I can be content. That's a pretty mind-blowing concept. And I find that interesting because at the moment we're living in a culture of discontentment and dissatisfaction. Let me tell you, recently my daughter asked for TikTok. And I'm like, she asked and then she asked again and then she asked some more and then she asked some more and eventually said, fine. And I looked up TikTok and I hadn't had it before and I Googled it and it was amazing. It said, actually, if your child's on TikTok, you can create your own account as their parent and you can monitor the time they spend on it. I can't see, everything, but I can monitor what she sees and I can monitor how long she spends on it during the day. So I reluctantly gave her TikTok and downloaded it myself. Oh my gosh, I love it. Don't, boy, the parents are going, don't say that, Pastor, now my kid's going to really want it. But there's so many creative, incredible people on there. It's like any social media, there's some dodgy stuff too. But me and my daughter, we can, we swap things. We send each other TikToks. I know it sounds pretty cringy for me to be saying that. But, oh boy, it's a lot of fun. It can be a lot of fun. I'm not on there a lot, but I enjoy it. I haven't made any videos in case you go searching for me. But what I did notice is this ad kept on coming up. And I don't understand it. What's it trying to tell me, right? It's trying to tell me I'm not good enough, that I should be dissatisfied because I'm losing hair, right? It's creating a culture of dissatisfaction. That's what advertising is supposed to do, right? Whenever we see an advertisement, we're supposed to go, oh, I need that. I want that. I'm not good enough, or I need this. I have to have that. I've got to buy this. There's so many ads on social media, right? You know how many ads we see per day? It's not just 10 or 20, it's in the thousands of ads that we see as we drive along on the sides of cars, on signs. Just driving here, you would have seen a few hundred on the shops on the side of the road. Advertising all meant to make us dissatisfied. About $50 a month, I can have my hair back, apparently. It's tempting. There's a lot more I can do with $50 a month than grow my hair for my own ego. We try and create a feeling of dissatisfaction in people. And, you know, I wonder if in the church we do the same thing sometimes. We're taught, when we're taught how to preach, that at the end of each sermon there should be an appeal. They say, don't preach a sermon without having an appeal. And an appeal is inviting people, like it's saying, you've got to change, you've got to grow, you've got to be different from how you are. It's us saying to you, you should be dissatisfied. So, you know, it's made me think about the dissatisfaction culture that we have. Paul has learned to be satisfied and content when he's in need. But more than that, he's also growing other people and pouring into the people in Philippi to encourage them. My dad learned the same thing. Because unlike me and my mother, my dad had a green thumb. And so I want to just draw in a little closer, because I didn't live in Broken Hill itself. I lived a little way out, about 30 kilometres out, past a ghost town called Silverton, which was the original Broken Hill. They found some minerals there, then they found a bigger lode over in Broken Hill properly. You've heard, you know, who's been to Broken Hill? Anyone been there? Oh, a few people. Good on you. It's a nice place to drive through on the way to somewhere better. But I love growing up there. And obviously, you know, BHP stands for Broken Hill Proprietary. That's where it started, because it's the biggest ore of silver, lead and zinc in the country. It was found in Broken Hill. So they mined it out. They really broke the hill. But out here past Mundy, you might be able to see, I don't know if this is a clicker, up here, there's a little body of water. And I actually grew up here next to the Umbrumbuka Reservoir. That was one of two water sources for the town of Broken Hill. So you can see how red it is. You can see the scrub dotting the landscape. You can see the trees clinging onto the edge. And while we lived in this rocky, dirt-strewn hill, Dad created this around our house. This is the house where we lived. Can you see this? So this is this house right here on the edge, right? And so this is what we had. On this rocky hill, all around our house was Dad's lawn. Emerald green, precise with squared corners. It was just this wonderland for your feet in the middle of rocks and prickles and thorns and gravel. A soft playground that me and my brother could grow up and play on to protect our feet. Pretty amazing. I took it for granted, and we'd go out and play on the grass all the time. He knew what it was like to grow where he was, to be content, and to transform where he was even. And in my father's garden was his cactus, because you know, some things that do grow, cactuses. And this cactus was spiky. It was one of the ones with the spikes on the end. It's kind of big leaves. And I hated it. It was right under the water tap. And whenever we went to get water or something outside, you'd get spiked, right? I'm like, oh, Dad, I hate this cactus. We've got to get rid of it. Can we dig it up? And it just sat there. It sat under the water tap, and every now and then water would drip. And this cactus just stuck there under this tap in Dad's garden. And I'd complain, can we take it out? Life would be better. But Dad said, no, just leave it there. It's all right. It's not hurting anyone. I thought it was kind of pointless. And then about 10 years of this tap dripping on it, something incredible happened. This amazing flower, this spike just started growing up out of it. This one incredibly beautiful bloom blossomed from this cactus. I couldn't believe it. This vivid bloom just shot up as tall as I am. All those drips from that tap were growing that cactus, even though we couldn't see it, even though it looked miserable and spiked us. It was growing. The cactus, you know, with the little that it had, made great beauty. Paul goes on in verse 12, though, about being content. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. So there's a couple of things to point out here. Paul again says that being content is something that he had to learn and calls it a secret. It's not something that obvious. This is some kind of knowledge that most people don't have, and they don't know how to get it. It's a secret. And I think today that's probably true as well. How many people do you know that would call themselves truly content today? Not many people, I would think. If you ever met someone who's truly content, it's recognizable. Like, what's your secret? How are you this way? You should be miserable, but you're not. They're content. It's a secret. And Paul says something really interesting. He says again that he knows what it's like to be in need, but he also says he knows what it's like to have plenty. He knows what it's like to be well-fed and to be hungry, but he says he has to learn to be content in both situations, whether you're in need or whether you're well-fed. Now, Paul was a Jew amongst Jews. He was a Roman citizen. He probably came from a really wealthy family. He knew what it was like to have plenty. But in his travels, as he moved around after his conversion, he learned what it was like to be in need. So he knows both ways of living. But for me, it was a surprise when I realized that people who have plenty also have to learn to be content. Because we expect only the poor to be dissatisfied. We expect if you have money that you should be satisfied, right? Because when you're poor, you think, if I just had money, I would be content. And mind you, I'm not talking about happy or joyful here. This word is content, satisfied within yourself and not in need of anything. But it turns out that's not the case. The very rich are not satisfied. This is Jack Whitaker. Have you heard of Jack Whitaker before? Oh my goodness, in 2002, he won the US Powerball, and at the time, it was the biggest amount that anyone had ever won. Can you see the figure up there? It's a lot of zeros, right? Boy. He chose, see what they do, they actually pay it out annually for you. You can get a lump payout, which is what he chose. Then they tax you. So in the end, he walked away with 113 million. All right? They'll get you, won't they? Those taxes. And I just want to point out that Jack was already a millionaire. He was a business owner. He already was worth $17 million. You think he would know how to handle an extra 113 million, wouldn't you? No, he didn't. He did a few things right. He set up a few trusts. He bought a house for the owner of the store where he'd won the winning ticket. He bought a Lamborghini and drove through his neighborhood throwing money out the window. Okay, if you want to do that, that's okay. It's not a bad thing. But then over the next 18 months, the police gave him ticket fines 250 times. I guess you're pretty noticeable in a Lamborghini, and they figured he had plenty of money to spend on tickets. 250 speeding tickets. He took them to court and claimed they were harassing him. In 2003, thieves stole a briefcase he was carrying, had $500,000 in it. 2 people from the local club that he would go to eat at were arrested for trying to poison him so they could get his money. Later that year, more thieves broke into his home and stole another $200,000. He had to employ 3 people just to go through the mail that he got from others asking for money. In 2004, it gets really dark. His granddaughter, whom he gave $2,000 a week for pocket money, overdosed on drugs, and her boyfriend did as well in the same year. It gets really, he ends up being sued by a casino, and the lady who he gave the house to, she got harassed as well, and she was mugged because they just assumed she was rich now. It's a nightmare. Winning the lottery, coming into that much money, you are much more likely to be sued, much more likely to be killed by a family member, much more likely to die of a drug overdose, and nearly 1/3 of lottery winners end up bankrupt. Having plenty doesn't bring you contentment. Don't get me wrong, having nothing doesn't bring you contentment either. And so I want to be clear about the picture that Paul's painting for us, what he's telling us. Your feeling of contentment is not dependent on your external circumstances. Rich or poor, it doesn't matter. You have to learn the secret of being content. Think about that rich young ruler. He had everything, didn't he? He had youth, he had power, he was a ruler, he had wealth, but he knew there was something missing from his life. He had no contentment. Jesus tells him to give those things up, and he goes away troubled, uncontent, dissatisfied. He doesn't want to give up those things. Let me say it again. Your contentment is not dependent on your external circumstances. And I know that I've talked a lot about a financial aspect of it, but there are many other types of living in need, aren't there? Maybe you're in need of emotional support. Maybe you're in need of a friend to have a shoulder to cry on, but right now there's no one. You feel alone. Maybe you're in a desert spiritually. You feel far from God. Maybe your health is suffering and you need assistance, but you're struggling. Maybe that's the kind of desert that you're living in right now. Maybe you're living in a really difficult situation at work, or maybe there's an incredibly hard situation at home. And you're just, how am I going to get through this? And there's no one to help you. You're alone. Maybe you're in plenty. Maybe you're overworked and so in demand from people that you don't have a spare minute to yourself and you're just about to lose it. Maybe you just can't find a time to step aside and be on that quiet mountaintop with Jesus. Maybe the demands of family and work have overwhelmed you. Maybe COVID has just been too much and you feel like you're drowning in the pressure where you are. And here's why what Paul says is amazing, because he knows you can be content even in those circumstances. And not only be content, but to thrive and to grow and to share with others. Now, I want to put a caveat in here. Don't get me wrong. If you're in an incredibly bad situation, I'm not saying you've got to stay there. There's nothing wrong with moving a plant to better soil, is there? But I'm saying while we wait on that, we can have a spiritual and existence inside an internal life that belongs to God and to us, where we can be content, and not only be content in ourselves, but to help others who are dissatisfied. And that's what we're talking about today, isn't it? Not only just being content in ourselves, but blooming where God has planted us for the sake of others. My father's garden was an orchard. We lived up here on this hill. Right down the hill here was where Dad worked. This was actually you can see the wall there that was constructed to make this reservoir. And down here was the pumping station that pumped the water into Broken Hill. And that's where Dad worked. So he lived up here, he'd go down here every morning, come back in the afternoon. Not content to make a lawn, down here he grew an orchard in the middle of a desert. He had vast lawns around where he worked. Enormous orchards. They grew oranges, lemons, grapefruit, and bananas, although we didn't get to the bananas, the cockies were too fast for that. But during the summer, my brother and I would just walk down to visit Dad at work and pick oranges as big as my hand, just bursting with juice. And we would devour them in the heat. And not only that, whenever we had visitors to our house on the weekend, Dad would say, let's go get some fruit. And he would drive the visitors down to this orchard. He'd unlock the gates, take them in and let them pick however much fruit they wanted to take home. They'd pick to their heart's content. There were so many trees just bulging with fruit. Everyone always went away happy with great big bags full of oranges. Dad knew how to be content where he was, but he also knew that that meant sharing with those around him. So how does Paul do it? What's his secret? Well, he tells us a secret in verse 13, of course. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. You've heard that verse, right? Paul's talking about his contentment in need and in plenty. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. He can't do it alone in his own strength. You know, isn't that the original lie? Satan came and said, hey, Eve, you're not good enough. You need this piece of fruit. You're not good enough by yourself. You need this thing. And we're still falling for that trick. We need the right education. We need the right iPhone or the right mobile. We need the right car, the right house, the right suburb, the right job, the right education. We've got to add these things to ourselves before we think we can be content and satisfied. But it's not true. We can be content through him who gives us strength. Paul's achieved his contentment through the one who has given him the strength to do it. Wherever you've ended up right now, you can be content and grow, because these things don't depend on your external circumstances. Your growth will be an expression of how much you allow God's strength in. And when you anchor your faith in God, when you say, my contentment rests on Jesus, no one can take that from you. The solid bedrock of your life, the rock that is Jesus Christ, cannot be taken from you. If you put your contentment on anything external, on the job that you have, or anything like that, that can be taken, that can be gone. Then where's your contentment? But when you say, no, I'm content and I'm strengthened through Jesus, then nothing can separate us from the love of God that is in Jesus Christ. Amen. God is our water, Jeremiah 17, 7-8. But blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord, whose confidence is in him. They will be like a tree planted by the water that sends out its roots by the stream. It does not fear when heat comes. Its leaves are always green. It has no worries in a year of drought and never fails to bear fruit. When we trust in the Lord, we are like that well-watered tree. Heat won't affect us. Drought, we don't care about that. We've got a source of water that cannot be interrupted. In my father's garden, just outside our back fence, out in the wilderness, in fact, but a part of my dad's domain, were some Guangdong bushes. I said Guangdong. Who's ever had Guangdong before? All right, gold star for you guys. I hardly ever find anyone who's eaten Guangdong before. It produces this beautiful red fruit. It's about the size of a lychee, I guess. And inside you can see this, it's a giant stone, and the kids in Broken Hill would use that to play conkers. If you don't know what conkers is, ask your grandparents. If they even remember, it's just about gone, right? Conkers. They're an incredible source of vitamin C and antioxidants. They kind of taste like rhubarb, but with a little more tang. I love them, but you can't get them anywhere. You've got to order them dried and have them delivered. They don't store very well, but for me, they taste best when they are stewed up and cooked into a pie. And while the kitchen was primarily Mum's domain, when the Guangdong harvest came, Dad took over. He'd roll up his sleeves, he'd take a whole weekend producing pie after pie, bubbling the stewed fruit. He'd mix them with this bright white sugar to sweeten it. He'd roll the pie crust out, and then he'd put in the mix. He'd put the pie crust on top, sprinkle it with sugar, put a little smiley face in it. And then he'd sell it to the local pub, and the tourists would come and pay for a slice of Guangdong pie, bush peach. There's nothing better than a hot piece of Guangdong pie with ice cream. I'm sorry to make it sound so appetizing when I know you won't be able to have any today. When I moved away from home, I couldn't find it anywhere. I just grew up with it at the back. I'd just go out and eat them whenever I wanted to. And I couldn't find any at the local nursery. So I went and did some research. And it turns out that Guangdong trees are very hard to grow because they're hemiparasitic. So here's a Guangdong bush. You can see the Guangdongs growing wild there. Hemiparasitic means that as their roots grow underground, they seek out the roots of other plants and join with those roots. So you can see here it's growing in front of a tree. It attaches its roots to that tree. And so the tree's roots, which go a lot further and a lot deeper, get a lot more water. And so when that water comes up, the Guangdong has a drink as well. And that's how it survives. It can't really grow very well alone. It can, but it won't grow anything. So it's hard to grow commercially, but it's perfectly suited for those conditions in the outback. Doesn't matter what the soil's like. If it's a drought, it can thrive because it's connected to a source of water, a source of life outside of itself. So as Paul says, it's the one that strengthens us that means we can be content because we're not connected to the outside for our contentment. We're connected to Jesus. And when we are, we'll bring forth fruit as well. Colossians 1, 5 and 6. The faith and love that spring from the hope stored up for you in heaven and about which you have already heard in the true message of the gospel that has come to you. In the same way, the gospel is bearing fruit and growing throughout the whole world, just as it has been doing among you since the day you heard it and truly understood God's grace. When we have that connection with Christ and understand the gospel of his grace, we will bear fruit that spreads around us. Now that I'm older, I realize why I had a black thumb. It's because I never watered my plants. I never paid them any attention. And I think about my dad in his garden. He was out there all the time with that lawn, right? He obsessed over the bits of red dirt that crept in, and he would water. You know those old sprinklers? He would move that sprinkler every 10 minutes methodically around each lawn every week to make sure that the lawn had enough water. And it grew. He put an automatic watering system in the orchard down at his work, so he could just turn the tap on and this entire orchard would be watered at once. He pruned the Guangdong trees. He cut the mistletoe out of it, and he protected it against bugs, and he watered it as well to make sure that it could grow. When my dad's garden was nourished and watered, it grew, even in the harshest desert. And it's the same with us. When we let God nourish us, when we let God water us, we will grow no matter where we are, even in the harshest conditions. Maybe you're a lawn right now. Maybe you're an orchard producing fruit. But maybe also you're a cactus. You'll still grow and flourish, even with a drip of water every now and then. And of course, that's the reality. We are our Father's garden, and he grows us, and he puts us where we are. This is where I would normally put an appeal, but I don't think I will today. I don't want you to feel dissatisfied at the end of my sermon. But what I will do is invite you, as Jesus did to the woman at the well, to drink from that water today. It will sustain you in the deserts of your life. It will grow you no matter where you are. You will be content and you will grow fruit that you'll be able to share with the world.